The workers carried it up from the excavation pit in sections, roped and braced against wooden beams. It was January 1896. The light over Thebes was winter pale. Flinders Petrie stood in the courtyard of the mortuary temple of Merneptah and watched the final piece emerge from the trench, black granite, 3 meters tall when reassembled, several tons. The surface was dense with hieroglyphs carved so deeply the shadows inside each glyph made the stone look alive even in flat noon sun. Petrie had been in Egypt for 14 years by then. He knew immediately this was not decorative work. This was a victory stele, the kind of monument pharaohs commissioned to announce military campaigns and glorify their names for eternity. He walked the perimeter of the stone twice. Before he began reading, the hieroglyphs were clear. Merneptah, son of Ramses II, had erected this monument around 1208 years before the Common Era. Campaigns in Libya, victories over northern peoples, the standard rhetoric of pharaohs who never admitted defeat and always claimed total annihilation of their enemies. Important historically, but not extraordinary. Petrie kept reading, line after line of conquered cities, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, Canaanite names. Then he reached line 27. He stopped, read it again, called his colleagues over. No one in the excavation camp slept that night, because there, carved into black granite by order of an Egyptian pharaoh 3,000 years earlier, was a name that had never appeared in any known ancient text outside the Bible: Israel. Not a rumor. Not a legend passed down through oral tradition and written centuries later by scribes with theological agendas. A name carved in stone, ordered by Egypt. The enemies of Israel talking about Israel, and the implications were immediate and destabilizing. In 1896, the Bible was effectively the only historical source claiming Israel existed as a distinct people in the ancient world. No Egyptian records mentioned them, no Assyrian annals, no Babylonian chronicles, no Hittite treaties. Skeptical scholars had argued for decades that Israel might be a literary invention or a greatly exaggerated tribal coalition retrofitted into a grand national narrative by later editors. Believers responded with faith, but not with independent corroborating evidence. The debate was open and unresolved. Then this stone surfaced. An inscription commissioned by one of the most powerful rulers of the ancient Near East, explicitly naming Israel as a recognizable entity significant enough to include in a royal victory monument. It was not scripture talking about itself. It was the historical record of another civilization talking about Israel. And what it said created a problem no one had anticipated. The text of line 27 is brief, 5 words in the original Egyptian. The translation reads, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more." That sentence has generated more than a century of scholarly debate because of one seemingly minor detail. In Egyptian hieroglyphic script, the way a name is written reveals whether it refers to a place or a people. Geographic locations receive a determinative symbol indicating land or city. Human groups receive a different determinative indicating population. Israel on the Merneptah Stele carries the determinative for people, not place. This means that in 1208, before the Common Era, Egypt recognized Israel as a group of people, but not as a territorial state, not a kingdom with borders, not a nation with a capital, a people, which aligns with what the Bible describes for that period, the era of the Judges, when Israel was a loose confederation of tribes without centralized monarchy. But it also raises a question that has defined biblical archaeology ever since. If Israel was already in Canaan by that date, functioning as a recognizable people visible enough for Egypt to record and claim victory over, then when did they arrive there? And from where? The man who provided the first rigorous technical analysis was Wilhelm Spiegelberg, a German philologist working at the University of Strasbourg. In 1896, he published a detailed study confirming the reading. The name was unambiguous: Israel. No paleographic uncertainty. But Spiegelberg went further. He analyzed the geographic and military context of the inscription and concluded that Merneptah's campaign took place in Canaan, the region the Bible calls the Promised Land, which established that by 1208 Israel was already settled there. Not in Egypt, not wandering in Sinai, in Canaan. This created a chronological tension that remains unresolved. If Israel was in Canaan by that date, the Exodus must have occurred earlier. But how much earlier? And if the Exodus happened earlier, why does the biblical chronology place it in ways that do not align neatly with the Egyptian historical record? The stele does not answer these questions. It opens them. There is another problem embedded in the text itself. The inscription claims Israel is destroyed, its seed eliminated. If taken literally, Israel would have ceased to exist in the 13th century before the Common Era, which obviously did not happen. So the language must be rhetorical. And it was. Egyptian victory inscriptions followed strict conventions. Pharaohs never lost, never compromised. They always annihilated their enemies, at least in writing. But if the language is formulaic and exaggerated, how much of it can be trusted? Israeli archaeologist Israel Finkelstein has argued that the stele proves only that a group called Israel existed in Canaan in the 13th century, visible enough to merit mention by Egypt. Nothing more, not their size, not their power, not their origins. A reference point in time, not a confirmation of biblical narrative. And yet that single reference changed the entire framework of the debate. Before 1896, the question of Israel's historicity was theological. After 1896, it became archaeological. That sounds like progress, but it also meant the questions became harder, more technical, more fragmented across disciplines. And every answer opened two new questions. One detail about the discovery is rarely discussed. When Petrie found the stele, it was not in its original location. It had been reused. Merneptah had taken the stone from an earlier temple of Amenhotep III and carved his own text over a partially erased inscription, which means the monument itself is layered, one history written over another. And it raises a question no one can answer. How many other texts were repurposed, erased, or destroyed before anyone could read them? Most ancient records were written on papyrus, wood, leather, materials that decompose. What survives is not the full archive of history, it is the accident of what endured. Line 27 survived, but what else did not? The stele was not hidden after Petrie found it. It was published, photographed, translated, and debated within months. Yet for decades it remained marginal in popular understanding of biblical history, not because scholars rejected it, but because institutions that shaped public interpretation of Scripture had no framework to accommodate it. The question is not whether the stone was suppressed in the melodramatic sense, but why its implications took so long to enter mainstream discourse about the Bible. And the answer lies in how religious and academic authority operated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. When Petrie announced the discovery, the dominant centers of biblical scholarship were European theological faculties embedded within church hierarchies: Oxford, Cambridge, Berlin, Tübingen. These institutions did not reject archaeology, but they controlled how archaeological findings were interpreted and integrated into theological curricula. The Merneptah Stele presented a problem of chronology that could not be reconciled easily with traditional timelines derived from adding up genealogies and reigns in the Book of Kings. If Israel was in Canaan by 1208 before the Common Era, then the Exodus had to be pushed earlier than many conservative chronologies allowed. This was not heresy, but it was inconvenient. So the stele was acknowledged in specialist journals and footnotes, but rarely taught in seminaries or churches. It remained expert knowledge, insulated from lay audiences by the barriers of academic language and institutional gatekeeping. This was not conspiracy. It was structural. Knowledge does not spread automatically. It spreads through teaching, preaching, publishing. And those channels were controlled by institutions with theological investments in particular readings of Scripture. The pattern repeated throughout the 20th century. Each new archaeological discovery that complicated biblical timelines was welcomed by specialists and ignored or minimized by popular religious education. The Dead Sea Scrolls revealed textual variants that showed the Hebrew Bible was far less stable than previously assumed. The scrolls were celebrated, but their implications for biblical inerrancy were softened in pulpit summaries. The Merneptah Stele discovered in 1993 confirmed the existence of the House of David, which believers celebrated as vindication. But it also dated to the 9th century, meaning the united monarchy of David and Solomon left no contemporary inscriptions during their reigns. Only later memories carved in stone by their descendants. That absence was not discussed with equal emphasis. Archaeology became a tool selectively deployed. Findings that seemed to confirm Scripture were amplified. Findings that destabilized traditional chronology were acknowledged quietly in academic contexts and filtered out of popular teaching. The Merneptah Stele fell into this second category for generations. It was too important to ignore among historians, but too disruptive to emphasize in churches and religious schools. It was known but not taught, published but not preached. The silence was not imposed by edict. It emerged organically from institutions protecting coherence in their own narratives. There is another layer. For much of the 20th century, biblical archaeology was dominated by scholars who were also believers, often clergy or seminary professors. Their work was rigorous, but their interpretive frameworks were shaped by faith commitments. When findings aligned with Scripture, they framed it as confirmation. When findings complicated Scripture, they framed it as incomplete data requiring future clarification. This was not dishonesty. It was the epistemological stance of a discipline still defining its relationship to theology. But it meant that objects like the Merneptah Stele were presented as curiosities rather than pivots. Interesting but not paradigm-shifting. It took the rise of secular biblical archaeology in the late 20th century, led by scholars like Finkelstein and William Dever, to force the question into the open. What if the Bible is not a historical archive, but a theological document written centuries after the events it describes, shaped by the needs and beliefs of its authors? That question had always been possible, but institutional religion had the power to keep it marginal. The stele could not be erased, but its implications could be contained, and they were for nearly a century. The stone itself never moved far. After Petrie excavated it, the Egyptian authorities transferred it to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where it remains today. It stands in the main hall on the ground floor, positioned among other monumental stelae from the New Kingdom. 3 meters of black granite. Line 27 is at eye level. Thousands of visitors pass it daily. Tour guides mention it briefly, if at all. Most people photograph it without reading the labels. It is simultaneously one of the most important documents in biblical archaeology and one of the least noticed objects in one of the most visited museums in the world. The irony is almost unbearable. This stone, which contains the only mention of Israel in Egyptian records from the 2nd millennium, sits in public view while the vast majority of people who care deeply about biblical history have never heard of it. That is not the fault of the museum. It is the result of a century in which religious education and academic archaeology developed on parallel tracks that rarely intersected. The knowledge existed, but the mechanisms to transmit that knowledge broadly did not, or were not activated. There is a broader truth embedded in this. History survives by accident. The Merneptah Stele was reused, which is why it was preserved in a temple wall instead of discarded or broken for building material. Most monuments were not so lucky. Most inscriptions were lost. Most records decomposed. What we know about the ancient world is not what happened. It is what happened to endure long enough for someone to find it and read it before it disappeared again. A single stone, a single line, 5 words. And those 5 words have rewritten entire fields of scholarship. Not because they answered the questions scholars were asking, but because they forced new questions no one had thought to ask. If one stone can do that, what else is still buried? What other names, dates, events are waiting beneath the sand or embedded in walls no one has excavated yet? The knowledge we have is not the knowledge that existed. It is the fraction of knowledge that survived the collapse of civilizations, the recycling of monuments, the decay of papyrus, and the indifference of centuries. And sometimes it survived only because someone decided to carve it deep into stone. The stele stands in its glass case in Cairo. The lights in the museum dim at closing time. The granite turns darker. The hieroglyphs recede into shadow. Line 27 is still there. The name is still there. Israel is laid waste. Its seed is no more. The pharaoh was wrong, but the stone remains.